Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and I want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices both in Sacramento and San Francisco. For today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher Lunna Lopes, who is going to present the findings of PPIC's latest survey on Californians and education, specifically K through 12 education. We'd like to thank the Dirk and Charlene Capsanel Foundation, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the Silver Giving Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation for their support of this annual survey. We'd also like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle, the PPIC Donor Circle for helping make this event possible, including the lunch you had today. At registration, you should have received a document containing some of the key findings from the survey. The full survey and the slides from today's presentations are now available online at ppic.org. After Luna's presentation, we'll have plenty of time to answer questions and just a couple of things. We'll actually bring a mic around, and because we're recording this, please wait for that mic to come to you before you ask your question. A few more things before we begin. We have a couple of upcoming events that both will be taking place at the Sheraton. On April 24th, the event is Preparing California for the Census 2020, featuring leaders and experts from federal, state, and local level discussing actions needed to ensure a fair count. And on May 14th, Women in California Legislature event will feature the current and former members on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the first female members elected to the California State Legislature. So they were elected before the state was a state, which is pretty exciting. If you'd like to attend both events or either of the events, please sign up soon. We expect them to fill up very quickly. And later today, of course, you'll receive a short survey via email, and we ask that you please take that few moments to fill that out and let us know how we did today. And also, please turn off your cell phones. California's K through 12 education system is large in size and scope by any measure. It represents the state's largest general fund expenditure at $54.6 billion out of a budget of $132 billion. And when combined with local property tax, funding is expected to top $78.3 billion in the 2018-19 budget. It serves 6 million students in kindergarten through 12th grade. The next largest state, Texas, serves about 4.5, so it's a pretty big jump between the size of school districts or schools served by states. It has 10,000 schools with approximately 1,000 school districts. California's student body is diverse, and many of the students struggle with poverty on levels that we sometimes overlook because of the wealth in the general state. Because schools are such an important factor in California, PPIC annually conducts a survey focused on K through 12 education, which you're going to hear about today. So you may have heard it's an election year. I know, we're all very excited. It feels like the last one's not even over, but this one's coming. There are two important races that will affect California's public schools, the governor's race and the superintendent race. In the poll, the governor's race continues to look a lot like it did last month. And our poll finds that the voters, the few that are paying attention, a lot fewer than I'd like and a lot fewer than those people behind Gavin Newsom would like. They say that education is an important issue for candidates and that they're going to be paying attention to the issue of education. The public supports more funding for education and optimistic about recent school reforms aimed at disadvantaged students, despite the fact that few of them know much about the LCFF program. They like their local school, again, despite the fact that they don't know that the California schools rank below average on the national English and math tests. Which to me sometimes feels a little like the phenomena where people like their local elected official or their legislator, but don't like the other guy who represents the other people. So we'll have to see what goes with that. One of the most interesting questions is parents say they're getting a lot of information about their schools, but they don't know anything about the new dashboards that were unveiled last year. Very few do. So which leads us to ask the question, where are they getting their information? Turning back to the election, this is the first time we ask about the superintendent race. And not surprising, the former front runner for the governor's race, Don't Know, has a commanding lead of 74%. He or she's very, very popular. The two candidates with the most money in the infrastructure to run the statewide race we polled, and they are tied at 13%, which is really low 2 months out. This may speak to the fact that the voters just don't know the two candidates, although Marshall Tuck, one of the two candidates we polled, ran 4 years ago and got 2 million votes. 2 million votes from some very forgetful voters, apparently, but they're out there. I'm just saying, this is a race to watch, and I really think it's an important race. There'll probably be a lot of interest in this race, and if you care about K through 12 education, it's absolutely a race that we're going to be watching through the rest of the election. Finally, I want to remind you that PPIC puts online all of our crosstabs for all Californians and registered voters or likely voters, and those crosstabs have a wealth of information, and I recommend that you look at them, and they're available online for this poll and all of our other polls. Now with this, I'd like to invite Lunna to come up. Lunna, as you will notice, is going to bring another student to the state of California shortly, hopefully not today here at the session. So.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for coming today. Before I start, I want to thank my co-authors on our survey report. First, Mark Baldessari, the President, CEO, and Survey Director at PPIC. Our Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner, Alyssa Dykman, who's a fellow Survey Research Associate. And I also want to thank our funders for really making this series possible and for continuing the survey on Californians and K through 12 education. So first, I'm going to just review a little bit, tell you a little bit about PPIC statewide surveys for those who may not be particularly familiar with our statewide survey series. Then we'll kind of get into the meat of the findings. There's two real sections to the survey here. We have a first section on kind of perceptions, attitudes, and we cover the 2018 election, and then we shift to asking questions about LCFF, funding preferences, raising revenues for K through 12. So first, just to cover a little bit about the statewide survey, our mission really is to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data, and to inform the state policymaking process. We try to raise awareness and encourage discussion. And a key thing for us is to provide a voice for all Californians. So this is why we don't just survey registered voters or likely voters. We'd survey all adults, and we find that to be especially important when looking at K through 12 education, since a lot of parents, for example, or public school parents are not necessarily the same population as likely voters in the state. This survey was conducted from March 25th through April 3rd. We surveyed 1,700, just over 1,700 adults. This includes 867 likely voters, 523 parents with children 18 and under in the household, and 391 parents who have children in California public schools. And some of the topics I'm going to cover today include the approval ratings of the governor and the legislature, opinions on local public schools. We also asked about immigration in public schools, school safety, and the 2018 election. And as I said, in the second section, we cover more revenue and funding questions, so adequacy of funding, sources of revenue for public schools, LCFF, and also the local control accountability plans. So first, we're going to get into what we tend to ask every survey, which is the approval ratings of the governor. For our K through 12 survey, we also ask about the governor's handling of K through 12 specifically. So looking at the governor's overall job approval rating, half of adults and likely voters approve of the way Jerry Brown is handling his job as governor. Approval is similar to what we found in March and also similar to what we found last April. As you would expect today, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to approve of the job the governor's doing. When it comes to K through 12 public education, fewer than half approve of the way the governor is handling the K through 12 public education system, with 1 in 4 saying they don't know. So this is pretty typical when we ask about approval rating on specific issues. We see higher levels of don't know. So when we ask about handling of the environment or K through 12 or higher education, we see higher levels of don't know on these approval questions. The approval ratings on his handling of K through 12 were similar last April. And again, we also see in this question that Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to approve of the way the governor's handling K through 12 education. So looking now at the state legislature, today 46% of adults and 42% of likely voters approve of the way the legislature is handling its job. And again, approval was similar in March and similar to what we found last April. And given who controls the state legislature, Democrats are much more likely to approve of the way the legislature is handling its job than are independents or Republicans. When it comes to the way the state legislature is handling the state's K through 12 public education system, 42% of adults and 34% of likely voters approve, while 1 in 5 say they don't know. And again, this is similar to what we found last April. And notably, though, we do see that approval of the legislature's handling of K through 12 is higher among public school parents than among adults overall. So next, we wanted to know how Californians perceive the state's per pupil spending and test scores when compared to other states. So according to the National Education Association's Ranking and Estimates report, California ranked 29th out of 50 states in expenditures for public K through 12 education on a per pupil basis. When we asked Californians where the state ranks in per pupil spending compared to other states, pluralities of adults and public school parents say the state's per pupil spending is either average or below average compared to other states. Relatively few Californians saw the state as being either near the top or near the bottom. And something that stood out to us, we found that Republicans are more likely than other groups to say that the state's spending is near the top. So about 1 in 4 Republicans said that California is near the top in per pupil spending. So we also found that African Americans, or across racial and ethnic groups, were more likely than other ethnicities to say that the spending is near the bottom. So you see Republicans tend to think that, are more likely to think we're at the top. African Americans are more likely to say that California ranks near the bottom in per pupil spending. The good news is that compared to 20 years ago, fewer adults today say that the state's spending is below average or near the bottom. More say it is above average or near the top when we look at, compared to 1998 when we asked this question then. Turning now to the other side here with the student test scores, according to just the recently released this week National Assessment of Educational Progress report, California ranks below or near the bottom in both English and math test scores for grades 4 and 8. We found that solid majorities of adults and public school parents say that California's K through 12 student test scores are average or below average compared to other states, while relatively few perceive the state as near the top or near the bottom. And as with the per pupil spending ranking, we see that fewer adults today say the state's student test scores are below average or near the bottom compared to when we asked this question in 2015 and when we asked it 20 years ago in 1998. So looking now at local public schools, this is a question we've asked repeatedly. We asked Californians to rate the quality of public schools in their neighborhoods today, and majorities of adults and public school parents give passing grades. So actually we found that at least half of adults have awarded a grade of A or B since 2005. Today, we find that fewer African Americans and whites give their local public schools grades of A or B compared to Asian Americans and Latinos. And we find that public school parents are slightly more likely than adults overall to rate their schools positively, giving them an A or a B. So we do see that, among parents, they're actually slightly more likely than adults overall to have these kind of, positive ratings of their local public schools. And next, with racial and economic segregation of public schools a continuing concern, particularly given the emphasis and the continuation of the achievement gap, we asked Californians how important was racial and economic diversity in their local public schools. So looking first at racial diversity, that's the dark blue, darkish line there, bar there. Solid majorities of adults and public school parents say it is extremely or very important that public schools in their community have a mix of students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And notably, we see that African Americans and Latinos are more likely than Asian Americans and and African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos are more likely than whites to say that this is extremely or very important. So turning to economic diversity, we still see that a majority of adults and about half of public school parents say it's extremely or very important that public schools in their community have students from a mix of economic backgrounds. And here we found that the share holding this view varies across income groups. So those adults who live in households that make under $40,000 a year are more likely to say that this is extremely or very important than those who live in households that make over $40,000 in household income a year. Next, we wanted to explore parents' perspective and see, what they think is the biggest problem facing local schools in their community. So we asked an open-ended question, asking them what is the biggest issue facing, your local public schools, and nearly 1 in 4 parents named lack of funding as the biggest problem facing schools in their community. So other problems that were mentioned by at least 5% of parents were quality of teachers, safety and bullying, lack of parental involvement, and large class sizes. So this is once we shift to that second section where it's more funding related, you'll see it really falls in line with a general sense that there's not enough funding for public schools. Next, we asked parents, so this question was only asked to parents, about the school preference that they have for their child. So we presented 4 different types of schools and asked parents if cost and location were not an issue, which one would you send your child to? And we see that about a third of parents would choose a public school, 3 in 10 private school, and fewer would select a religious or charter school. And this is actually a national question that was asked in the Phi Delta Kappa's Langer Research Survey last year, and we found very similar results among adults nationwide. So next, given recent events, we wanted to touch upon 2 current topics that are impacting California schools. One is immigration enforcement efforts, and the second one is school safety. So looking first at immigration, we found that when we asked Californians if they're concerned about the impact that increased federal immigration enforcement will have on undocumented students and their families in the state's public schools, we found that 7 in 10 Californians are concerned at least somewhat concerned that this is going to have an impact on those undocumented students and their families. And this is pretty much identical to what we found last year when we asked this question, very similar levels of concern. As you can see here, Latinos are the most likely to say they're very concerned. So 59% of Latinos say they are very concerned compared to fewer African Americans, whites, and Asian Americans. And across parties, we found that Democrats are 3 times more likely than Republicans to be very concerned about the impact that increased federal immigration enforcement efforts may have. So when asked about sanctuary school districts, 65% of Californians and 72% of public school parents support their public school district designating themselves as a sanctuary safe zone to indicate that they'll protect undocumented students and their families from federal immigration enforcement efforts. And again, this finding, we asked this question last year, and it remains relatively unchanged from last April. As you can imagine and see here, there's some stark partisan differences on this issue. 86% of Democrats are in favor, 74% of Republicans are opposed. So this is a real polarizing issue across party lines here. That said, we found that majorities in all demographic groups and all regions of the state are in favor. And across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to be in favor, while whites are the least likely to favor their local school district designating itself as a sanctuary safe zone. So now turning to school safety, and the threat of a school shooting. Given recent events, we wanted to touch upon this issue and gauge how Californians are feeling about it. And we find that an overwhelming majority of Californians and public school parents say they are at least somewhat concerned about the threat of a mass shooting in their local schools. Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to say they're very concerned. So a majority of Democrats say they're very concerned compared to only 24% of Republicans. And across racial ethnic groups, we see that Latinos and African Americans are the most likely to say that they are very concerned about this threat. So following on that, we wanted to, President Trump has proposed allowing more school officials to carry guns in schools as a way to deter school shooters. When we asked Californians about this proposal, about 2/3 of adults and public school parents oppose allowing more teachers and school officials to carry guns in schools. And as with the issue of sanctuary school districts, we see a real stark partisan difference here. 86% of Democrats are opposed, while 60% of Republicans are in favor of allowing more teachers and school officials to carry guns in schools. Again, that said, opposition to this proposal is pretty widespread, with half or more across regions and all demographic groups opposing allowing teachers and school officials to carry guns in schools. Finally, we are now turned to the election. It's an election year, so we felt that we had to touch upon the gubernatorial race again. And given that this is a K-12 survey, we also want to touch upon the race for superintendent of public instruction. So first, looking at the gubernatorial race, Gavin Newsom remains the top choice among likely voters in the June primary. He's followed by John Cox and Antonio Villaraigosa, Travis Allen, and then Democrats John Chung and Delaney Easton. Notably, though, we still have 22% of likely voters who remain undecided. So at least for that second slot there in the top two, those voters seem to still be up for grabs. We also asked likely voters about the importance of the candidates' positions on K-12 and found that when thinking about the governor's race, 64% of likely voters say that the candidates' positions on K-12 education are very important to them, and a further 26% say it's at least somewhat important to them. Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to say that the candidates' positions on K-12 are very important to them. And we also see that parents of children 18 and under are more likely than others to say that the candidates' positions on K-12 is very important to them in thinking about the gubernatorial race. And next, we hadn't seen a lot of polling on the superintendent's race, at least not publicly released polling. And we thought, it'd be useful to see how likely voters are engaging with this race. And what we found was that they're not engaging with this race. So when asked who they would vote for in this nonpartisan primary election for state superintendent of public instruction, 3 in 4 likely voters say they're not sure. And 13 say they would vote for Tony Thurmond, 13% say they would vote for Marshall Tuck. One thing that stood out to us, though, is that when we look at Latino likely voters, they appear to be somewhat more engaged than white likely voters. So among Latino likely voters, 56% say they're undecided compared to 82% of white likely voters. And again, among Latino likely voters, it's still a tight race there, but right now 24% would vote for Tony Thurmond, while 20% would vote for Marshall Tuck. So at least among that population of likely voters, there appear to be a bit more engaged than white likely voters. So now we're going to turn to the kind of policy, the money section, I guess, right? So the LCFF and raising local revenues for K through 12 public education. So this is a question we've been asking since 2008. What do you think the current level of state funding for your local public school is more than enough, just enough, or not enough? And pretty consistent responses here. 6 in 10 Californians and likely voters and 2/3 of public school parents think the current level of state funding for their local public school is not enough. And findings were similar last April, and as you can see here, at least half of adults have said state funding is not enough, dating back to April of 2008. Today, we find that Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to say that the current level of state funding is not enough. And across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans are the most likely to hold this view, that state funding is inadequate. And this year marks the 40th anniversary of the passage of Proposition 13. And there's a possible 2020 initiative that would change how commercial properties are assessed. So we decided to ask, Californians if they would, how they would vote on this potential ballot measure that would assess taxes on commercial properties based on their market rate, and then direct some of that revenue to public schools. We find that 61% of adults and 53% of likely voters would vote yes on this potential measure. Democrats, as you can see, much more likely than Republicans and independents to say that they would vote yes. And we find that support is somewhat higher among public school parents than among all adults, and it's also higher among renters than among homeowners. One thing to note was that in our January survey, we asked a similar question about the split roll proposal, but we didn't mention the state, some of the revenue going to K through 12 education. And so when we asked that without the mention of K through 12 education in January, 46% of likely voters were in favor of the general idea of assessing commercial properties at market rate. So support was a little bit lower among likely voters when we don't mention some of that revenue going to K through 12 education. And in recent years, Californians have passed quite a few local school bond measures, and we passed recently one statewide bond measure for school construction. Today, a strong majority of adults and a majority of likely voters say they would vote yes if their local school district had a bond measure on the ballot to pay for construction projects. Support was similar last year, and in fact, as you can see here in terms of the trend line, since 1999, at least 6 in 10 adults and majorities of likely voters have said that they would vote yes on a local school bond measure. Today we see that solid majorities of Democrats and independents say they would vote yes, while fewer than half of Republicans would do so. And we also asked about local parcel tax, and here we see a majority of adults, though fewer than half of likely voters would vote yes to pass a local parcel tax to fund their local public schools. And support for local parcel tax has been at about 60% among adults since, and and about half among likely voters since 2009. So again, these are like very consistent findings over the years. And when it comes to the parcel tax, again, we see Democrats and independents, majorities of them say they would vote yes, and Republicans, 59% say they would vote no. Just to also mention, we also asked about a potential ballot measure to replace the 2/3 vote requirement with a 55% majority vote to pass local parcel taxes for public schools, and found that 57% of adults and 49% of likely voters say they would vote yes on a potential measure of that nature. So next we asked some questions that we've been tracking about the local control funding formula. And we thought that, with the proposed budget fully funding LCFF, we may see an uptick on, awareness of LCFF. And we see that consistent with what we found since we've been asking this question in 2014, 70% of adults have heard nothing at all about LCFF. So though awareness of LCFF is low, after we read a brief description of the policy, more than 7 in 10 adults and public school parents favor the policy. And support for LCFF was similar in 2017 when we asked this question. And we find that today majorities across parties favor LCFF. And so given the polarization we've seen on other issues, this is something that, when we're presented with a brief description of the policy, there is at least majority across all Republicans, Democrats, and independents in support of this funding formula. Next, with LCFF set to be fully funded, we want to know how confident Californians are that the school districts that receive this additional money will actually spend the money on English language learner students and lower income students. And we found that a majority of adults say they are very confident or somewhat confident that this additional money will be spent on these students. And again, this is similar to what we found last April. And majorities across racial ethnic groups express at least some confidence that this additional funding will go to the students it's supposed to. Though Latinos and Asian Americans are more likely than whites and African Americans to express at least some confidence. And we also see that across parties, Democrats, 65% of Democrats are at least somewhat confident that districts will spend additional funding on lower income and English language learner students, compared to fewer than half of independents and Republicans. Next, we wanted to look at LCFF and student achievement, and we found that Californians are at least somewhat optimistic that the implementation of the local control funding formula will lead to improved academic achievement among English language learners and lower income students. 7 in 10 adults and public school parents think the implementation of LCFF will improve academic achievement at least somewhat. And across racial ethnic groups, we see that Latinos and Asian Americans are more likely than African Americans and whites to expect some improvement. I think a particularly notable number here is that 41% of Latinos expect that academic achievement of these students will improve a lot. And we also find that across parties, strong majorities of Democrats and independents expect improvement, while Republicans are more skeptical. So 50% of Republicans expect improvement, 42% say the academic achievement of these students will not improve. And the LCFF requires districts to develop, adopt, and update their 3-year local control accountability plans, and to reach out to parents and the broader community for input. So we asked public school parents if their schools or school district has provided information about how to get involved with the LCAP process. And we found that 54% majority of public school parents say they have received information from their child's school or school district about how to get involved. And this is actually a slight increase from last year when only 46% of public school parents said that that was the case. And so that's kind of an improvement there. We see a majority of parents are receiving that information. We then asked, okay, so how likely are you to participate in the process of updating the accountability plans for your school district? And this might be a bit aspirational in terms of how they're answering, but we found that 28% of public school parents say that they're very likely to participate in the process, and 46% say they are somewhat likely to do so. And these findings were actually similar to what we found in 2017. Back then, 25% of parents said that they were very likely, 47% said they were somewhat likely to participate. And what we see today is that, among Latino public school parents, they are, more likely than white public school parents to say that they're at least somewhat likely to participate in updating the LCAPs, their district LCAPs. So finally, we wanted to know if public school parents felt they could easily find information about the quality of their child's school and to see how familiar they were with the new school dashboard. We found that an overwhelming majority of public school parents feel they can easily find information about their child's school, or the quality of their child's school. However, when we asked about the school dashboard, we actually found that the majority of public school parents say they have heard nothing at all about the new school dashboard, which, as Deborah mentioned, kind of begs the question, where are they finding this information, right? And so that's something that I think we'll want to explore in future iterations of this K-12 survey. Notably, what we found is that Latino public school parents are more likely than white public school parents to have heard at least a little about the new dashboard. And even among parents who say they can easily find information, only 48% say they have heard at least a little about the California school dashboard. So even among that, that 83% who say that they can find information easily, most of them have not heard about the school dashboard, which really begs the question, where are they getting that information? Is it from friends and family? Is it from the school website and things like that? So this is something that we hope to kind of explore in future iterations of the survey. So finally, just a few kind of key points that I think we found interesting from the survey. Californians support having their local school districts declared as sanctuary safe zones. This is something that we found last year, and it's really based on a real level of concern about the impact that federal immigration enforcement efforts can have on the undocumented students and families in their school districts. Many public school parents are also concerned about school safety, but the kind of proposal out there of allowing more teachers and school officials to carry guns in schools is pretty unpopular across the board. That said, there are some real deep partisan divisions on this issue and on the sanctuary district, school district issue. And across parties, majorities of likely voters agree that they see K-12 as an important issue when thinking about who they're going to vote for governor. And that said, when we switch to the superintendent's race, this is a race that's really going to impact K-12, and an overwhelming majority of likely voters seem to not be really engaging with the race yet. California adults and likely voters continue to see a real inadequacy in the level of state funding for K-12, and this is after the last few budgets have increased funding for public schools. So it's something that as we move forward, it's a really consistent finding that there's a sense that there's not enough money there for public schools. And while public school parents say they can find information on the quality of their child's school, most have not heard about the new school dashboard. So we really want to kind of continue investigating where are parents getting this information. Do they find it easily? And is it something that, is it a trusted source? So these are all things that we want to explore in future iterations of this survey. So I think with that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Just wait for the microphone. No?
I just one question about the SPI race. because you only, I know there's 4 candidates, only 2 of them are likely to have money, but
Yeah.
one of there's a third candidate who actually has a okay ballot designation.
Mm-hmm.
If you had tested her as well, do you think do you think she would have even?
Yeah, so we have we have to set a threshold for the
Yeah.
candidates that we'll include. As you can imagine, if we didn't have a threshold, the gubernatorial
yeah,
race would be like 30 people. So basically, we only include candidates that have a certain level, meet a certain criteria, which includes having fundraised a certain amount of money, and among other things, and endorsements and things like that. So.
All right, you think you're going to test it again, or?
I don't know. This was kind of our one chance here with the K through 12 survey. I really was interested in asking about this race because it's not something I really see people polling, even though it's a race that's getting a lot of outside money in and things like that. And so I'm not sure. The thing with surveys is this is a K through 12 specific one. We won't have another K through 12 survey this year, and it's always a balance trying to figure out what things we want to ask about and how much time we have to ask them in. It's tough to keep people on the phone for 20 minutes, so we have to kind of do some trade-offs there with questions.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
How does California look relative to other states in terms of their perception of public education?
So the hard thing is there's not a lot of questions that we asked here, like LCFF specific things like that we haven't I haven't seen at least nationally. But that question that we ask about rating their local public schools, like rating them A through F, it's actually very similar to what we find nationwide. There is a similar national question that is asked of that, and California looks pretty similar to the country as a whole.
Thank you. I wondered if you happen to know whether it would require a state law for teachers to be able to carry guns in schools, or could that be a county matter?
I am not aware of that. I mean, I'd imagine that you could have competing laws and state law would potentially supersede that. But as far as I know, I'm not sure about that. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. Have a great day.